without being hostile to it. Un périple sinueux. A sinuous journey, but full of accomplishments and efficiency. The seeds they sowed will bear fruit in time, God willing. To preserve our majestic icons and defend their precious legacy. It's our turn. Join us in the showed dates.
For more information about the conference, please visit www.arabrrc.org/Moslehun.
For their interesting and very important panel. Now I would like to invite Dr. Khaled Abul Fadl to make his speech. His speech will be about why democracy matters in the Muslim world. Dr. Khaled Abul Fadl is founder of Usul Institute. Faddal ya Doctor.
Be with you. For over 3 years now, the prominent Saudi reformer Sheikh Salman al-Auda has been in prison. What we know about the conditions of his detention are extremely alarming. According to various reports, Sheikh Salman al-Auda has lost a considerable amount of weight, has lost most of his vision, most of his hearing. He is kept in solitary confinement, and there are alarming indications that his emotional state and mental health are deeply affected. Sheikh Salman al-Auda is a larger-than-life figure. It is not an exaggeration to say that he is one of the most important Muslim theologians, jurists, and scholars in the past 200 years. One of the most significant theologically and jurisprudentially, and also one of the most influential. All indications is that the Saudi government is following a policy intended to slowly kill Sheikh Salman al-Auda. There are 37 charges. The Saudi government continues to insist that they are seeking the death penalty against them. But we might even not get to a point of convicting and sentencing Salman al-Auda, because the indications, as I said, is that the government is slowly killing him. This is extremely alarming, and what I want to comment on specifically is why. And to contextualize the arrest and mistreatment and threat of murdering Sheikh Salman al-Auda. This is a part of a post-Arab Spring assault, systematic, organized, orchestrated assault against moderate, democratic thinking in Islam. We are living in an odd time where, while there is a considerable amount of talk, as usual, in the human rights field about the virtues of democracy and the need to democratize, but it is undeniable that in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, in Bahrain, even in Algeria and in Jordan, there is a well-orchestrated, systematic assault against all forms of theological thinking in Islam that is supportive of reconciling Islamic theology and ethics with democratic governance, accountability in governance, limited power in governance, rule of law in governance, and a system of rights enjoyed by individuals in governance. It is as if the governments, the post-Arab Spring governments of the Arab world, are saying democratic thought can exist as long as it is purely secular, but not if it is in any way founded or rests on a foundation of Islamic ethics. This is not a new thing. We all know that when Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi wrote his famous treatise against despotism in Islam, he was targeted during the Ottoman period by authoritarian bureaucrats and the functionaries of authoritarianism. My own teacher, Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, when he wrote his first book during the monarchy in Egypt, Al-Islam wal-Istibdad al-Siyasi, Islam and Political Despotism, he was promptly jailed by the monarchy in Egypt. And every time Sheikh Ghazali has attempted to reconcile between Islamic ethics and democratic governance, there was a severe backlash by the various regimes that ruled Egypt. The same can be said about Sheikh Qaradawi when he has written on Islam and democracy. And in fact, it is not an exaggeration to say that in the 19th and 20th century and now the 21st century, that every Islamic thinker who has attempted a systematic reconciliation between Islamic ethics and democratic values was targeted and persecuted. The only democracy, in my view, the only democracy that can survive in the Muslim world is a democracy that reconciles itself with Islamic values. The idea of a democracy that is antithetical to Islamic values has no future in the Muslim world. And I think those who rule countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the Emirat know that very well. And that's precisely why they target people like Salman al-Auda. Because they are targeting the ideological thrust of democracy itself. We must recognize that the idea that al-istibdad al-siyasi, political despotism, as an unethical enterprise is well supported in the Islamic tradition. We know that the Quran called upon Muslims to conduct affairs by shura, consultation. We know that there is a long debate in the Islamic tradition as to whether shura mulzima or ghayr mulzima. Is it that a government is bound to consult or not bound to consult? And is a government bound to follow the results? In other words, are the results of consultation binding upon a government or not? That's a long debate. But what is constant is the Islamic tradition is an istibdad bil-ra'i naqisa akhlaqiyya, that despotism is a moral defect, an ethical defect. Despotism was justified in Islamic history throughout, in numerous shapes and forms, as a matter of necessity and a matter of pragmatism. But it was always recognized as a rather non-ideal situation, an ethical failure that can be tolerated, but an ethical failure nonetheless. What people like Salman al-Auda do and have done in their scholarship is to argue systematically and persistently that there is no way to reconcile between despotism and monotheism and Tawheed. That the very notion of Tawheed, the very notion of being a Muslim and submitting to God, means that you cannot submit to a mundane ruler absolutely and totally. That no mundane ruler has a moral claim to represent the will of God. And that's exactly what makes him so dangerous. That's precisely why Muhammad al-Ghazali was imprisoned. That's precisely why every democratic Islamic thinker in the 19th and 20th and 21st century was persecuted. And it's a matter of conscience to the world. The world constantly is fond of talking about Islam and despotism. But the world manufactures the condition that it condemns. We don't rise up to condemn the persecution of Muslim Democrats when it occurs. And we don't go out of our way to protect Muslim Democrats. And in fact, there is a deeply embedded hypocrisy where when it comes to the Muslim world, we actually prefer authoritarianism and military governments over democratic governments that reflect the will of the governed for financial, for commercial, for purely practical reasons. There are many people who are fond of the idea that Israel remained the only democracy in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, because it serves their political interests. All of this is why Salman al-Auda is persecuted. But this is also why the persecution of Salman al-Auda must end. It is a blotch upon the conscience of the world. The world of human rights, the world of democratic advocacy will remain in a perpetual state of hypocrisy as long as people like Salman al-Auda remain in prison and confront a very dark future. Thank you for listening to me tonight, and I hope that next time we meet, Salman al-Auda will be a free man. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now we are watching the second movie about belonging. Then our second panel starts, The Muted Reformists, moderated by Dr. Birol Başkan, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute.
ليس فقط لأرض عاش فيها، وإنما انتماء الإنسان للأرض التي يجد نفسه فيها، يجد إيمانه، يجد شخصيته. ومن هنا علينا أن ندرك أن ما يسمى أو ما نسميه نحن بالوطنية ليس مجرد أغاني أو أناشيد ولا شعارات ترفع ولا برامج تقدم، وإنما حقيقة الوطنية هي صناعة الانتماء في الأجيال، أن يشعر الناس أن هذا الوطن لهم وأنه يصدر عنهم وأنهم ينتمون إليه، أن هذا الوطن حفي بهم، حريص على مصالحهم، حريص على إيجاد الحياة الكريمة لهم. لأننا نشاهد اليوم ما يسمى بالهجرة، هجرة الكثير من الشباب المصري، الشباب الليبي، الشباب المغربي، الشباب العربي، يهاجرون عبر البحر، وأحيانا الهجرة قد تكون بين قوسين غير مشروعة بطرق بسيطة، ربما يركب المئات منهم في قارب قريب للعطب ويهلكون متجهين إلى إيطاليا أو إلى فرنسا أو إلى إسبانيا أو إلى مكان آخر، هائمين على وجوههم. لماذا يهاجر هؤلاء؟ لأنهم لم يجدوا الحياة الكريمة، لم يجدوا العمل، لم يجدوا الفرص، لم يجدوا التعليم. ولذلك أعتقد أنه فعلا في العالم العربي هناك فقر في الوطنية يجعل هذه البلاد ليست مكانا جاذبا، بل هي في الغالب مكان طارد.
Welcome to our second panel titled The Muted Modernist. I have three speakers in this panel. Before I give the floor to them, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this very important conference on very important figure, Sheikh Salman Al-Awda, who is a kind of a hero to me because of his audacity to speak against the power in a very authoritarian regime. And more importantly, and equally importantly, is that he gives legitimacy, religious legitimacy, to much needed religious legitimacy to a concept which is very much misunderstood in the Muslim world, reform. And by giving legitimacy to this concept, I guess the Sheikh is implicitly and explicitly confessing that there is a problem in the Middle East. There's a problem in the Muslim world, and we have to address that problem. That's why it is an honor for me to moderate this panel in the name of Sheikh Salman Al-Awda. So we have three speakers. They don't need any introduction, really. Dr. Mahdavi Al-Rashid, Dr. François Bourka, and Dr. Anel Shelin. They don't need any introduction, and I don't want to take your time with this. If you just Google their names, you will see what they contributed to study of Saudi Arabia in particular, and then the Middle East, Islamism, religious movements, etc. So I will give the floor to our speakers. I give them each of them 10 minutes, plus minus 2 minutes, to give their opening statements. Then I am going to ask questions to them, and we will proceed. Thank you for joining this panel. And should we start with Dr. Mahdavi Al-Rashid?
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this event at a very critical time for Sheikh Salman Al-Awda. We heard news about his deteriorating health in detention for almost 3 years now. He is gradually losing his hearing and vision. And it's important to raise awareness of the plight of this individual together with so many others who are detained in Saudi Arabia. I came across the writings of Salman Al-Awda and the personality of Salman Al-Awda in the very, very early 1990s. In the context of research on Islamism in Saudi Arabia. And I came across this figure who actually, at a very young age, managed to mobilize a lot of people. And it was the context of the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and Saudi Arabia amassed 500,000 international soldiers to prevent or mitigate against a possible invasion of the country from Kuwait. At that time, Saudi Islamism reached its height. There were so many religious scholars and followers who had joined their efforts around this event. And the dispute at the time with the regime was that Saudi Arabia had failed to defend its own borders as one of the, in fact, the most Islamic, the most important Muslim state, had failed to defend its borders, and it is relying on foreign troops, mainly American troops, to come to Saudi Arabia, which is actually known in the discourse of Islamism as Bilad al-Haramain, the land of the two holy mosques. And Salman Al-Awda was one of the outspoken members of what was called As-Sahwa Al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Awakening. And he distinguished himself because he was a great speaker. He had charisma among his followers, and his followers initially were his study circle in Burayda, in the center of Saudi Arabia, in the Qasim district. But his reputation was actually far beyond that small city. And he also used communication technology, mainly the cassettes at that time in the early 1990s, where he would record his sermons and speeches in addition to his study circle in the mosque. And the tone at that time was a kind of very courageous young preacher who can inflame the imagination of his listeners. He talks about why nations fall, and that was extremely timely at the time. Because he outlined in not only religious terms but also in sociological terms how nations come to decline. And this kind of combination of religious knowledge with modern sociological analysis distinguished what we in academic circle call al-mufakkir al-Islami. So he was not only a sheikh who is traditionally trained in scholastic Islam. He combined that kind of traditional classical education with engagement with modern social science, with modern history. And so that was my first encounter with Sheikh Salman al-Auda. After the early 1990s, obviously he was put in prison, and he was brought from his own house and his own study circle, and his followers reacted to that at that moment, and they came into the streets in order to prevent his detention, and it was called Intifadat Burayda, which is the uprising of Burayda. He spent a lot of time, a long time in prison throughout the 1990s, and then he was released. When he was released, he became quieter for a long period of time. And then he was cooperating with the regime in Saudi Arabia in order to help with anti-terrorism efforts. So he presented himself as someone who could negotiate, communicate with jihadis in order to wean them out of their ideology of violence. But what is more striking, if we want to look at the last 10 years, there was a critical moment for Salman al-Auda and for many people in the Arab world, and that is the 2011 Arab uprisings, which surprised not only the dictators of the region, but the region itself. The people themselves realized for the first time, the power of the crowd, which they had been denied over decades, because especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, demonstrations, any kind of civil action, civil resistance is forbidden. And therefore, that critical moment enchanted the whole of the Arab world, including Sheikh Salman al-Auda. And I do remember writing about his recent intellectual journey, recent ideas, in a book entitled Muted Modernist. So I call Salman al-Auda of the 2011, Salman al-Auda of the 21st century, a modernist, by which I mean that he combines a kind of Islamism with an opening on reason, on rationality. And although Salman al-Auda, let's not forget, had a very traditional Salafi upbringing in terms of the framework of his mind. He was trained in the Wahhabi tradition that the Saudis want to be called the Salafi tradition, to give it more legitimacy worldwide, because the word Wahhabi is very specific to Central Arabia and its own historical religious tradition. So the Salafization of the Wahhabi movement took place in Saudi Arabia in order to make it more legitimate around the Muslim world. But Salman al-Auda was trained by famous Wahhabi sheikhs. He was able to look at their writings and interpretations of religious sect with a modern eye. So after 2011, he immediately wrote a book called Questions of Revolution. And that was a response to what was happening in Egypt at the time. And for a Salafi or Wahhabi sheikh to say that revolutions are legitimate from the Sunni Islamic tradition was revolutionary. As you know, the trends within the dominant Saudi religious tradition about Salaf, that comes out of the Wahhabi tradition, any kind of revolution is called khuruj ala al-hakim, which means rebellion against the legitimate Sunni Muslim author. And therefore, you can apply the punishment of haraba because you are against the consensus of the Muslim Ummah. And the Saudis propagated ideas that you have to tolerate the unjust Muslim ruler because overthrowing him poses greater danger. So this was the dominant Sunni interpretation in Saudi Arabia. We come to Salman al-Auda and he says, no, that is not khuruj ala al-hakim. Revolution is to correct a historical process that has gone horribly wrong. And he looks at the Egyptian case and many other cases and cites also examples from world history, from the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. And he argues that revolution under the conditions that had prevailed in the Arab world has become inevitable. And there's nothing wrong about it. In fact, not engaging in revolutionary action to topple the unjust rulers such as Hosni Mubarak, Gaddafi, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, etc., would be against your religious duty. And so we sense that the revolutionary sentiment was there in this book. But at the same time, Salman al-Auda combined in his writing from the very beginning two trends. He was a nationalist concerned with his own nation, his own society in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, he was also internationalist with great interest in what was going on in the whole of the Muslim world. So we get two trends, Salman al-Auda al-Qawmi, the nationalist, and Salman al-Auda al-Umami, the one who is open to the whole Muslim world and even Muslim minorities in the West. So the Ummah consists of all those Muslims. And he found that quite a lot of them, especially in the Arab world, share certain kind of injustices. But the interesting thing, after he discusses that revolution, like the ones that happened in the Arab world in 2011, were not an aberration. They were not kufr, blasphemy, but they were important sociological development, almost inevitable, because humans cannot tolerate injustice forever. And it's an Islamic duty to remove that injustice by legitimate means. He did show that he was in support of the peaceful actions that was dominating these revolutions from day one, and the regimes responded with force. So Salman al-Auda comes across in the last decade as a humanist as well. If you follow his media, especially his own YouTube channel, his own personal life, which he was very, very keen on showing to and sharing with the rest of the world. So as you know, in Saudi Arabia, not many men, or specifically also religious sheikh, would like to share intimate moments with their children or with their family. But Salman al-Auda did that. And here you would see YouTube videos of him playing with his little girl, or after the tragic death of his wife, we see him combing the hair of his daughter, playing with her. And this is very unusual in a country like Saudi Arabia. Religious sheikhs should have the authority and should pose as like invincible characters that you cannot penetrate their personal life. Whereas here,
Doctora,
with Salman al-Auda, we
opening
see
statement?
that kind of human. Another important view that he had, there were only three other things I would like to mention before I finish. He had this kind of humanism projected towards the immigrants who live in Saudi Arabia. As you know, 30% of Saudi population, almost over 10 million, are immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world. So he posts videos about we are all equal, we are all descendant from Adam. And therefore that gives him that kind of humanism and the quest for social justice for immigrants. The other thing which distinguishes him is his views on gender towards in the last decade. He seriously believed in the equality of men and women, and he also reprimanded Saudi religious scholars for issuing fatwas, for example, against women driving. And he attributed that to mixing between the social conservatism of the religious scholars and the Islamic text. And again, he said, women, there is nothing in Islam that prohibits women from driving. It's a social tradition. And he went as far as also talking about modern sexuality. So, for example, his views on homosexuality, which was taboo in Saudi Arabia. You don't talk about it, although it's prevalent, like in any other human society and animal society as well. So he presents interpretation that are actually derived from religious texts, but give it a twist of modernism. Like and finally, his view on what to do in terms of the Sharia after a revolution or the revolutions that toppled the regimes. He was absolutely against imposing Sharia by force, and this is an allusion to what goes on in Saudi Arabia before Mohammed bin Salman came to power, because the Sharia is supposed to be imposed from above on people. So he argued in his book on revolution, if you take the example of Tunisia that had half a century of harsh secularism, he argues that it's not a good idea to impose Sharia on the Tunisian people the day after the revolution. You need to educate people, and if they choose to have the Sharia as their law, then through modern means of election, you can actually have Sharia law as the law of the land. And here it is really like, although Al-Auda didn't mention Saudi Arabia by name, but everything he said in that book applies to Saudi Arabia. And obviously the situation in Saudi Arabia is at the back of his mind when he wrote these kind of pamphlets and books. So I'll stop here, and we will carry on after the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this very sweeping coverage of Sheikh Salman's ideas and positions. So, Dr. Burga?
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be with you now, although I know it will be very difficult to speak after Madawi Rashid, for at least one reason or two reasons. She knows a lot, and the second reason is I am absolutely not a specialist of Saudi Arabia. Although I have hitchhiked through the Mamlaka, I'm quite proud. It's not so many Westerners who've traveled hitchhiking in Saudi Arabia, but I lived extensively in Yemen, but I'm not really familiar with the political system of Saudi Arabia. Therefore, I will concentrate on another angle. I feel concerned about Sheikh Salman because I had the privilege of meeting him. First, it was, I think, in Istanbul, in the European Council for Fatwa and Research. And he was precisely involved in jurisprudence on European Muslims, which fits into what Malawi just said of his opening toward the world. Then I met again in Doha, and therefore I am personally concerned with what is imposed to him now as an individual. I am concerned, of course, by whatever is imposed to Salman by the Saudis. But I am even more concerned, and this will be my point, I am even more concerned by the silence of the Westerners and of the French. And I would like to elaborate a little bit, but I will not go beyond my time like Malawi did, because I rely upon what she has said, which fits perfectly what I want to say. But let me give you an anecdote to summarize the regional atmosphere of what is happening. Establishment. Early sometime in 2020, we had a visit in Paris by the former Minister of Justice, Saudi Minister of Justice. He came as the head of the World Islamic League. What did he say to us? What did he say to President Macron? Oh, I am here to invite you, to encourage you to repress political Islam. You know, this is the planet where we live. We have a Saudi sheikh who comes to Paris and says, "Help me, and we shall help you repress political Islam." And when he says political Islam, we will later on go into terminology. But believe me, he means Muslims. I mean, he means nas mutadayyin, those who really, those who are not mulhid, who have not left the religion. They are considered political Islam. If they speak and they are Muslims, they will be considered political Islam. Okay, and of course another anecdote would be that we had Sisi being awarded the highest Wissam Sharaf early December. And then I would go into one last anecdote. In spring 2017, our big journal, it is Le Monde, it's like New York Times, New York, supposedly a leftist, but it's no longer. He said, I would like a piece on an influential Muslim intellectual. And I said, okay, I have an idea. But then we had an argument because when I mentioned the name of Salman al-Auda, they didn't know him, never heard of him. Okay, they knew Kamel Daoud, all those North African intellectuals who, in the language we understand, tell us what we want to hear, and what we want to hear is a discourse of demonizing 95% of the Muslim landscape all around the world. Okay, so we had an argument, and I said, you know, he has 13 million followers on Twitter. You should maybe consider that, whether you like it or not, he is influential. And then they agreed. But if you Google the piece, you will see that they made a caricature of his face to make him look as a Neanderthal man, you know, like some kind of crazy ape-faced. This was the way they supported this lousy choice of mine. Okay, so I wanted to understand why is it that we have this position in France and in many parts of the world. In fact, it is not so new. If you look at this situation, I would bring it back to Sharm el-Sheikh Anti-Terrorism Congress as early as 1996. In this Congress, there were all European leaders, all Arab leaders, all autocrats of the Arab world. And there was the Russian leader Eltsin, and there was Yasser Arafat, and there were, of course, the Israeli leadership. What did they decide? They decided to blame any resistance to the world order, any resistance, any opposition to every national order, every resistance to in the frame of the Palestinian conflict as having ideological roots. They labeled all of these activists as fundamentalist, as Islamist. And this was a good way to move around a mundane assessment of a political situation over ideologizing and leaving the feet no longer are on earth. And when you look at Salman al-Auda and what has been said by Madawi Rashid fits exactly in what I wanted to say. Now, I don't like, we might have it later on, but I don't give much importance to the terminology. Is he a Salafist? Is he rather closer to Muslim Brotherhood? No, I want to know what he does with his science, with these roots, this rooted culture in the religious rooted culture. What does he do? What kind of norm does he promote? And I would like to add to what Madawi said in the field of not sexuality but social. You know, the French and the Westerners, we are fascinated by polygamy. Someone who is not totally immediately opposed to polygamy, we cannot even speak to him. But I enjoyed hearing Salman, move from deeply religiously rooted position into some kind of modernity using very efficient means of articulating his thoughts. So in this field of polygamy, he said, I tell you about my own one wife that you are entitled to choose and love is better than two wives which are imposed upon you by your family. And I think this is marvelous. He does not go against as a matter of principle, but he moves the society slowly toward some kind of what we shall or not call modernity. The term is very dangerous. But, in old fields, and of course the red line was what he said, and this also has been said by Madawi Rashid, about revolution. About revolution, he promoted a revolution into the Islamic thinking. So this is what attracted me in his person, and what attracted me is its permanent inability of the Western environment to see this political activist for what he is, at a time when, he said Bismillah, so whatever comes after, we shall not consider. Is not part of our system, since he refers to religion both in the private and in the public sphere. So I think this is the contradiction. This is we Westerners should address when we speak to our political elites. And if you want to see the worst of what is going on in this category of issue, come to France. Come to France. Thank you so much for your attention.
I thank you, sir. Dr. Shaleen?
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to get to be here. So for my remarks, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this broader context within which Saudi Arabia adopted this sort of public relations campaign of so-called moderate Islam. And then beyond that, to get into sort of how it's possible that Saudi Arabia would be treating one of their most significant sort of reformers and thinkers who's really thinking serious about this, and that they've put him in jail at the same time that they are claiming to sort of be returning to so-called moderate Islam. So I'll be talking about that topic sort of more broadly. So just in case anyone needs this background, just a reminder that MBS adopted the rhetoric of so-called moderate Islam at Saudi Arabia's Foreign Investment Initiative in October 2017. He said that he would return his country to so-called moderate Islam, saying, "We are returning to what we were before, a country of moderate Islam that is open to all religions and to the world." And at the time this was met with so much praise. The entire world was ready to embrace this and this young prince. And in America in particular, he then went on this sort of charm tour. And the elites and politicians and tech giants were all so excited to sort of jump on this notion that Saudi Arabia is moving towards moderation. And then that all went off the rails after the murder of Khashoggi, and it was revealed that all of this was merely a PR campaign to sort of cloak what he was actually doing, which was engaging in this extreme level of repression, sort of which had not been seen, arguably, in living memory, or at least was similar to a level of what was experienced during the fears of the regime in 2011 at the possibility of popular uprising. So all of that to say, where do we get this notion of moderate Islam, and why was the world ready to jump onto that? And essentially, it's not clearly defined, and the connotations have shifted over time, at least in English, this notion of moderate Islam being separate from the notion of wasatiyya, or which is itself a Quranic concept, has been sort of glommed onto the notion of ittidal, which does not come from the Quran, but is a more accurate translation of the notion of moderation. So prior to 9/11, it usually it has always meant essentially to do what the United States wants. And before 9/11, that tended to mean, moderate Muslims were those who were willing to engage with Israel. And after 9/11, it has tended to refer to the repudiation of violent extremism. And obviously this prompted a lot of critique from Muslims, the notion that Islam was not moderate without this modifier in front of it, which again is completely false, that moderation is itself a core component of Islam. There are various hadith where the Prophet Muhammad emphasized that, Islam was supposed to be more of sort of a middle path, in contrast to those, fundamentalist Christians who would do things like become monks and, or nuns and be completely celibate, and the Prophet saying that was not his intention for his own followers. Also, obviously, again, the notion of the al-Wusata itself coming from the Quran, that the Muslim nation was supposed to be to sort of embrace this path of moderation. And certain influential figures like Yusuf al-Qaradawi had emphasized the notion of wasatiyya, and Qatar's decision to host Qaradawi permanently, as well as its sponsorship of Al Jazeera, at the time one of the only semi-free news networks in the region, helped to contribute to Qatar's reputation as being sort of this bastion of moderation. Again, at least prior to 2011, and obviously my esteemed co-panelists have mentioned 2011 as a critical juncture after which a lot of thinking on this shifted. But even prior to that, 9/11 also being clearly a critical juncture, we saw the Bush administration acknowledging for all of their horrible decisions in the region, the Bush team did acknowledge that democracy was something that could address the issue of terrorism, that if there were more responsive governments, if there were if issues of corruption and lack of opportunity could perhaps be addressed with greater government accountability, which obviously was one of several justifications given for the invasion of Iraq, which obviously was a fiasco. But in general, these other regimes around the region were really worried about this notion that the US was going to continue to promote democracy as a means of countering violent extremism and trying to address some of the factors that caused a very limited number of individuals to embrace terrorism. And so it was often these regimes themselves that were only too eager to endorse the notion that, no, it's not about democracy. It's really about Islam. Islam is the problem here. And we ourselves are the moderate Muslims. But those scary terrorists, they're the problem. And we need to separate kind of, we that stand for stability and moderation. You need to continue to support us. And they very much contributed to this notion of grouping all Islamists together under this sort of umbrella of terrorism. And that, unfortunately, both Americans and Europeans really lacked sort of the nuance or just the knowledge of Islam and bin Laden, for example, that the willingness to violence is really a key difference that should distinguish this. The willingness to characterize someone as a terrorist. So we saw early on individuals like Musharraf in Pakistan and Erdogan in Turkey both embracing this notion of moderation as sort of early adopters of that. And then later on, you saw other countries like, for example, Jordan was an early adopter of the language of moderate Islam with initiatives like the Amman Message of 2005. And then little by little, you started to see the Gulf countries adopting more of this. So for example, under King Abdullah, who established his International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue in 2011, a center in Vienna. And again, the shift of 2011, meaning that suddenly there was a lot more concern about Islamists. They were seen as potentially a threatening political force in a way that prior to 2011, they were perhaps not taken as seriously as having the capacity to overthrow these governments. And so, like I said before, Qatar had previously perhaps been categorized under the sort of the moderate moniker. Suddenly after 2011, they were no longer moderate in the eyes of Saudi Arabia, certainly, and the UAE, who then worked very hard to convince the US that Qatar needed to be grouped with this sort of under the terrorism label. And that's part of what allowed then for the blockade to proceed in 2017. And so it's around that time that we then see more of this language around moderation coming out of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So the UAE launched its Soft Power Council in April 2017, followed soon after by its Soft Power Strategy. And this was not quite as explicit. This was just pursuing soft power more broadly. But also things like their establishment of the Ministry of Tolerance, for example, Ministry of Happiness, in terms of projecting this image that, we are this bastion of moderation in the Middle East. And in the UAE, this did, in fact, reflect, to a certain extent, the reality of life in the UAE, where, the number of Emiratis themselves is a tiny fraction of the total population, that non-Muslim foreigners can live and interact in the UAE in a way that perhaps feels more familiar to them, having come from a non-Muslim context. And so it wasn't as difficult for the UAE to sort of make this lift in embracing this mantle of so-called moderate Islam, because to a certain extent it was backed up by sort of social mores there, as well, to a certain extent, of some of their laws. And so under the tutelage of Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman also tried to sort of adopt this PR strategy, as I said, in October 2017, coming out with this statement that he was going to return Saudi Arabia to moderate Islam. And at the time, again, sort of before everything went off the rails after the murder of Khashoggi, there was there was this great willingness to sort of interpret what was happening in Saudi Arabia as the disempowerment of the clerics, that, you know, Western American experts for a long time have been aware of the dynamic, the power dynamic between the Al Saud and the ulama, that within Saudi Arabia, these two power centers ruled together, and that they sort of propped each other up and legitimated each other. And so MBS's declaration and his policies, for example, lifting the ban on women driving, was very much interpreted as the Al Saud cutting out the clerics from sort of the ruling power structure. And so the imprisonment of people like Salman al-Auda in 2017 were seen as evidence of this, that, oh, the Saudis, you know, they're locking up these extremely conservative clerics. And again, the lack of nuance to understand that, in fact, the Al Saud power structure was not going after the sort of core ruling clerics who remained in positions of power in the Majlis Hayat Kubar al-Ulama, for example, in just other high-profile clerics, as long as these individuals were willing to sort of go along with, or at least not condemn, the social changes that MBS was beginning to implement. But anyone, for example, most clearly Salman al-Auda, who in fact was advocating for a more progressive ideas, for democracy, or at least for a shift in the power structure, they were very successfully painted, sort of tarred with this brush of, oh, you know, they're the conservatives. This is who MBS needs to sort of delegitimize the side and even imprison and murder if necessary, because this is the future of Saudi Arabia. So I don't want to go on too much longer, but just to perhaps explain what was referred to earlier as the level of silence with which the West, the United States, France, Europe, there's been a lack of awareness of Sheikh al-Auda's contributions, of his significance in Saudi Arabia, as well as the world more broadly, and just a lack of understanding of the difference between a figure like him, who stands for change and reform and rethinking the social, you know, the entire system within Saudi Arabia, and, you know, these sort of well-established clerics within the Saudi government, that there's just not enough awareness from the United States in particular to understand really the difference between them. So I'll go ahead and stop there and move on to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shelin. I have some questions. So I will pose them as general questions, and whoever wants to address them, just be my guest. The first question is about conceptual clarification. In both popular journals and academic journals, we see a lot of these terminology like Salafists, modernists, reformists, etc. And you also used some of these terminology, even though Dr. Burga warned that we should be looking at the actions and norms, not the concepts. I agree with that. Concepts might be distorting the actual image, the actuality, but also they might be helpful to position a person in the broader picture. So I would like to ask how Sheikh Salman al-Auda personify these different concepts that you have used in your writings and also in speeches like Salafism. I mean, especially I am puzzled given how much distance he has now with the Wahhabi religious scholars of Saudi Arabia and Salafis, especially in terms of literally understanding Islam and bringing modern ideas into his other. You know, is it really legitimate or fair to describe him, for example, Salafi, and then how would he fit into, for example, Muhammad Abduh's ideas that were expressed in the late 19th century, early 20th century? So can you use him as a case to illustrate these concepts so that our audience will be much more careful in the future when they are using these terminologies?
Yes, if I may intervene, there are just
Please,
two points as a response to what has been said. The first one is, Professor Bourgat mentioned the position in France. And Anne mentioned the position from the United States and what goes well with the various American administrations, and both of them, in a way, painted a picture of a West, that's for simplicity reason, that is ready to confuse this terminology. And even label some of them as a danger when they actually are not. But what is shocking is not the West and its perception of Islam. If you want to go for historical experiences and time, you will find that it's similar, and it goes both ways. But what is shocking after the detention of Sheikh Salman al-Auda is the silence of the Muslim world and the ulama institutions that are actually global. And it is almost like Saudi Arabia has silenced them all. Obviously, there are fringe councils that occasionally voice some kind of shock at the detention of somebody like Sheikh Salman al-Auda, but they are completely incapable of staging any kind of pressure to release him for the last 3 years. Given how he was welcomed in all those Muslim countries, his sermons were listened to in all these Muslim countries. It is shocking. It is actually a question that has never been posed. Why are Muslims silent, Muslim scholars silent, and they can't do anything about it through their own Muslim institutions? The second point is the detention of Salman al-Auda. I don't think Salman al-Auda was detained except for the reason that his trend, whatever we call it, Salafi, modernism, whatever it is, his trend poses more danger and threat to the Saudi regime than jihadi terrorism. Jihadi terrorism is a fringe movement that exists on the margin of Muslim society and had existed, and it had antecedents in the past. But the moment those people use violence and kill in an indiscriminate way, societies in the Muslim world reject them. And this is why they have to hide on the fringe of the Muslim world or on the fringe of big cities, big cosmopolitan cities. They are not mainstream. And once the violence starts, all Muslim societies had gone against them. Whereas somebody like Sheikh Salman al-Auda, he poses more danger because, for a very simple reason, you can be Muslim and an observant Muslim who leads a Muslim life in the modern world, and you can live happily. So this kind of very simple point annoys the Saudi regime. At the political level, also, Salman al-Auda poses more danger than jihadis because he offers interpretation for a representative political system, whether you call it democracy or you call it shura. Any kind of political representation is possible within Islam. It's not imported from Montesquieu or from somebody else outside the Muslim world. He reaches conclusions that show that if we interpret the Islamic texts that are sacred, not the interpretation of other ulama that happen to become sacred. So there is this kind of difference between the discourse, the religious discourse, al-munazzal, the one that Muslims believe is revealed to Muslims, and the mu'awwal, and that is, we have volumes of it throughout the last centuries of Muslim scholars commenting on the sacred text. And these are two different things. Muslims cling to their revealed texts, but there is a whole room for ijtihad when it comes to the writings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the writings of Qardawi, the writings of Muhammad Abdo, and the generations of Islamic scholars. So once you get to that position, that there is the core text that is revered, but also the other texts that are produced by the ulama are not sacred. Ulama are like us, a human being. They can interpret religion, and they may be right and they may be wrong. So once Salman al-Auda reached that, he became a danger to the Saudi regime because he can come out of interpretations that support the power of the people to represent themselves, the power of the people to form their own government, the power of the people to topple dictators, like what happened in these countries. Now, when I come to your question, and I'm going to be very brief, there are labels. Labels may be what we call them in academia as ideal types. But I think ideal types, they concentrate meaning, but maybe we don't find them in the real world. So there isn't like a pure Salafi or a pure modernist Muslim scholar. What we have with Salman al-Auda specifically is a hybrid discourse that uses the texts of the tradition, the scholastic science of religion, and he exercises his mental ability to interpret them in ways that fit into the context. So women driving, wasn't posed in the 7th century during the time of the Prophet. There was other things that were important at the time and different mode of transport. So once you do that, you open the possibility for human interpretation in ways that make you called modernist. So a modernist is not just a label we have to stick with, or the same applies to Salafi. So in a way, these labels help us conceptualize, but they are not the end product of our intellectual projects of understanding Al-Auda or other intellectuals.
2 short points, if you wish, if you have time. Yep. No, when it comes to terminology, first of all, even the concept of political Islam is no longer functional, in my understanding at least, because when you refer to political Islam, you refer to a spectrum which goes, as I put it, it should be updated, but from Ghanouchi to Baghdadi, okay? And we use the same concept at a time when we should concentrate upon the red lines inside this spectrum. Now, when it comes to these red lines, they are no longer functional. 20 years ago, I would describe easily what a Salafi is. A Salafi is a Muslim activist who hates the Muslim Brotherhood, who denies the Muslim Brotherhood the right to move their da'wah at a political level. Okay? But this red line no longer exists. In the post-Morsi, in the post-Spring Egypt, you had the Salafis moving in to compete on the political scene and creating what supposedly would ruin the unity of Al-Ummah from a Salafi point of view. So this is one good point for which I think is we should go beyond the terminology. Now, when it comes to the reasons why the regimes like the Emiratis are focused on the Muslim Brotherhood rather than on the jihadis, I used to say ironically because they are real experts on their own societies. They know, like Malawi has said, that the fringe, the extremist fringe of the jihadi mobilization cannot mobilize a political majority. They are not dangerous for at least 2 reasons. If you say, I am fighting against Daesh, you might have the entire planet sending planes to bomb them at a time when, although what I've said of Macron, it is a little more difficult to mobilize international support to fight. But of course, I am contradicting myself. There should be no mobilization to support he who is. It's a little more difficult to mobilize support to keep Salman al-Auda in jail, I would say. At the time, they know that Salman al-Auda is the most dangerous of their challengers because he has a popular legitimacy and he is the one who might one day or another get some kind of international understanding. These were my 2 points.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other intervention? Dr. Shalim, would you like to add something on the
trend that I've noticed a little bit just in terms of thinking about even the word Islamist, for example, that when, that to at least in my academic training, it's sort of relatively common to use the word Islamist to define someone who advocates for or is in favor of sort of a broader role for Islam in the public sphere. And, as was just mentioned, unfortunately, often sort of the word Islamist or the notion of political Islam is used as this umbrella term that does encompass everyone from Rashid Ghannouchi to al-Baghdadi of ISIS, of Daesh. And so what's been interesting, given that is the premise within which an American audience at least is operating, that there's been more resistance to this notion of even using the word Islamist to sort of describe someone, that to use that is to almost use a slur or something. And so I've gotten pushback on Twitter, for example, from using the word Islamist to describe an individual, for example, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who would in fact be in favor of a sort of expanded role for Islam in the public sphere. I mean, in the example of Salman al-Auda, my understanding is that he would also see himself as a member of sort of a movement for a better and truer adherence to Islam, which, from his interpretation would require, more responsive government and more rights, and that, the Saudi government would no longer be able to paint itself as sort of this paragon of, upholding so-called true Islam. But what has been so interesting is, again, this sort of lack of nuance, at least among American audiences, is this notion that, well, no, to call someone an Islamist is essentially to call them a terrorist. And so then, we're then left with this breakdown and understanding that, no, like within the Middle East, for many individuals, not for everyone, but for many, sort of the promise that of greater representation, of more democratic governments, at least in our current structure and the current political circumstances, has tended to come from Islamists, that these are the individuals that are pushing for greater government accountability and for of government, and that is again completely lost on an American audience who has really sort of bought into the notion that these are all terrorists, or that, to use the word Islamist is to sort of group them under a terrorist heading, which is really unfortunate, because again, it's sort of, I think it's coming from a good place, that maybe an individual is saying, be careful of your terminology, don't refer to this person as an Islamist, because that has a negative connotation. What they don't understand is that in fact it does not, or it should not have a negative connotation, that sort of this expanded role for Islam is something that many individuals would be in favor of, or that at least it is a legitimate sort of political surge or political movement within many parts of the region, which again Americans just seems to have completely missed. A lot of Americans within this sort of broader ocean of Islamophobia, which continues to be so prevalent. So the answer there, again, I think would just be more education for American and European audiences about sort of histories here and key figures, to have a more nuanced understanding.
Okay, thank you. Given the time we have left, I want to leave you with another question and leave the floor to you, then we have to close the panel. I have to combine all of my questions into one simple general question. And I really would like to hear your thoughts on the future weighting political Islam, Islamism, or in the particular case of Salman al-Awda. What awaits us, given this populist, backlash? Even in the United States, we see in Europe, the strategy Islamists adopted in the mid 1990s. If you remember Asif Bayat's term, which is post-Islamism, in other words, incorporating some modern ideals like democracy, women's rights, gender issues, so on and so forth, into their ideology. In other words, Islamism challenged the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. The reason why Erdogan was one of the first person who adopted that moderate Islam for the state is because he was coming from that tradition of Islamism is adopting these Western ideas. But given the fragility of democracy, even in the West, and more importantly, in my opinion, given that the states are now appropriating the strategy, which is, okay, we are the moderate Islams, not the Islamists. What turn do you expect in Islamist moments, in religious moments, in the Middle East? What is your thoughts? Okay, of course, it's about the future, but given the trends, how do you see the future for political Islam? Okay, Olivia Roy declared the end of political Islam in the 1990s, but still it is with us. What do you think is awaiting Islamism? And in the particular case, of course, Sheikh Salman al-Awda. Anyone?
Who goes first to this easy question? Okay, I will make a short point because I had to answer this question 2 days ago. I go back to my understanding of political Islam, and I make it very short. Political Islam, in my understanding, divides into two phenomena. One is in the field of identity, those societies which have been dominated by the West are reconnecting their political discourse with the terminology of their homemade culture. I do not say religious culture. I say they reconnect with the homemade symbolic system, which happens to be the religious one. This trend is not completed. This, in the face of the West, we use our own vocabulary and no longer yours, has not ended. In this sense, political Islam, the fact that people use the terminology of a non-imported culture will go on. Now, what will they do with this vocabulary? What type of political categories will they create? My answer is, I do not know, neither do you. Neither do you, or neither he or she. And I often conclude with a sentence which I take to the Anglophony. I say, it will be, at the domestic level and at the international level, it will be politics as usual. It will be politics as usual. There will be people speaking the language of political Islam, but God knows it's too complicated to say when and where there will be a strong renewal of the political landscape. So I would say, to be even more provocative, let's get rid of this blah, 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 blah on political Islam. Because this terminology makes a lot more noise than it produces light and understanding. Just let go to the root of actions of the political landscape. Forget the fact that they say Bismillah instead of Vive la France before they move into action. And let's see what they are doing in the field of universal values, because the values are universal. This is my very modest conclusion.
Thank you, Francois, for this conclusion. It's inspiring, I think, a return of the political without any qualifications or terminology. I think that from the very beginning, you know, we should, as academics, I mean, in our work, we have looked at those people that we call Islamists as political actors. But there is one point I want to add, and that is we are seeing globally the rise of some kind of populist hyper nationalism. And it is unfolding in all societies, across societies. You know, I mean, like if you look at what's happening between Britain and the EU at the moment over vaccines, you see that, you know, we are having vaccine nationalism. But what I want to say with regard to our topic is that, you know, if you look at the 20th century, you see how certain trends, the rise of what we call now Islamism, was a deliberate sort of move to fight certain politics that existed in the 50s and 60s, such as, for example, the left, the socialism, the nationalism, the anti-imperialism that was dominant during the 1950s and 60s. And political Islam or Islamism, whatever, was used as a counter dote, like a vaccine, actually, to fight those kind of trends. And now, ironically, we are using nationalism to counter what we used to call Islamism. So it is a cycle. But I mean, one thing that, you know, you mentioned two points, and that is we are entering a post-Islamist period using Asif Bayat's book, or Olivier Roy, the Death of Political Islam. I think, you know, from the very beginning, those who operated within an Islamic framework had the language of rights, had the language of, how we make just society. And therefore, I can't believe that we are going to have a date when we enter post-Islamism. It doesn't work like that. And the second thing, you know, if you think that the death of political Islam means they have failed to establish a state, the only examples are limited. You know, if you look at the Taliban, sometime in the Sudan, etc. But I think Islamism will remain as a moral framework in Muslim societies. It may not have the same impetus politically as its moral dimension. And that will remain, I think, but in a way, I think like the dictators who reinvented themselves as moderate Muslims, I think Islamist political parties are reinventing themselves as well. Francois Bourgat mentioned how the Salafis, who object to the idea of Hizb, political party, they formed a political party in Egypt. And in Morocco, they entered into government. So I think at the moment, 10 years after the shock of Rab'a, what happened in Egypt, I think there is even more diversity within certain Muslim Islamist groups or political parties. And I can't see at the moment that they have succeeded in reinventing themselves. They still have not recovered from the shock, the torture, the imprisonment, the detention, the diaspora. And they need probably, I don't know, another time to mutate. A key point in my writing about Salman al-Auda is the mutation of Islamism. It mutates like any idea. It expands, it contracts, it goes through change. And this is normal And even so, after the terrible conditions that had prevailed across the Arab world after 2011, with a lot of religious scholars, intellectuals had been put in prison from all the political spectrum, not only Islamists who are put in prison, others as well. So I think we will see more mutations, but it is important to remember that this is we entered this dangerous phase of this hyper nationalism that is populist and can actually lead to massacres, disasters, and xenophobia even more than what we had experienced before.
Just very quickly, I know Dr. Burka may need to leave, but just very rapidly, I think just one thing that concerns me about the future in general, to add to obviously the very apparent appeal of hyper-nationalism that has been spreading around the world, and often anti-democratic sort of the values, and for example, what we just saw with the attack on the U.S. Capitol, this sort of willingness to reject what were considered long-held democratic values in the United States, I think is very concerning. And this is especially so given that moving forward, one of the main issues that I myself am concerned about, and obviously the Middle East is going to be very much dealing with, is the upheaval coming from issues like climate change. Obviously, we're all meeting remotely as a result of this global pandemic. And so I worry about these sort of global level issues, whether it's pandemics or climate change or flows of people trying to make lives for themselves in other places. And that as a result of that, we're going to see a greater breakdown in social solidarity, a breakdown in kind of these bigger and broader identities, and more sort of adherence to smaller groups. And so I do think that is unfortunate, because as was mentioned earlier, figures like Sheikh Al-Auda do speak to these broader sort of human values that my hope would be that they could be universally shared and acknowledged, sort of the desire for equality and justice and opportunity as something that is sort of broadly resonates at a human level. And so I think what's unfortunate is that when people do start to fear each other more and are dealing with very frightening conditions, that those sorts of messages resonate less, that people really do kind of turn inwards and turn to kind of these smaller groups that they feel safer within, and they're less willing to sort of reach out to a group or to an organization that they see as potentially threatening. And so the concern there being that we very much need figures like Sheikh Al-Auda right now, and what I worry is that the opportunity within which he was able to really speak to people, I fear that may be passing, and that the opportunity for figures that are similar to him to sort of carry on his work in the future, I just worry that it may be harder for them to really reach people who are very much turning inward and feeling afraid. So that's sort of a depressing note on which to end. But just to reiterate the importance of Sheikh Al-Auda's work and of others like him who do try to speak to these sort of broader human values and who can transcend the fear and the divisions.
And with that, we end this great panel, informative, enlightening, thought-provoking, great panel, great speakers. I thank you all for attending this panel and sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your research on this very important figure. Thank you very much. And thus we end our panel. As Dr. Shalin said, we are living in strange times, and we need people who speak their consciences, who speak in the name of humanity, who speak in the name of morality. And I very much hope and pray that the Saudi Arabia releases Sheikh Salman Al-Auda as soon as possible, and other human rights activists. This is my sincere pray and hope, and wassalam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol Başkan and his panelists. Now, third video about tyranny and oppression. Later, the panel titled, The Case Against Tyranny, starts. It's moderated by Professor Mehmet Ali Büyükkara. He's a scholar at Marmara University.
نطلق الفرعونية على معنى أوسع. إن الإنسان يبحث هل أنت بداخلك فرعون صغير؟ مو بشرط إنه عندك جنود وأعوان وسلطة. يمكن فرعنتك على زوجتك مثلا، يمكن على ولدك، إن كنت معلم على طلابك، موظف كبير صغير مسؤول، التسلط على الناس، الاستكبار، الظلم، البغي، بحسب السلطة التي يستطيعها الإنسان. إذن هنا نحن نتحدث عن الفرعونية بمفهومها الشامل، والتي تصل طبعا في النهاية وبشكلها الأكثر تجليا إلى فعل الظالم الباغي الذي يتجرد حتى من الإنسانية. لأنه لو أردنا نعمل مقارنة سريعة، الآن الحيوانات مثلا الذئب والأسد ليش يقتل؟ هو يقتل للاحتياج، يقتل ليأكل، لكن لما يكون شبعان مو بشرط يفترس. الإنسان يتعدى حدود الحيوانية حينما يصبح يقتل لشهية القتل، والناس اللي يقتلهم لا يعتبرهم بشر. فهنا يكون تجرد الإنسان من إنسانيته، من أخلاقه، فضلا عن أي قيم أخرى. ولذلك الفرعونية هي تعبير عن الظلم. ممكن تشاهدها في السياسة الإنسانية اليوم، البشرية الاستعمارية التي تقوم على أخذ الخيرات وأخذ الخبرات وأخذ المعادن من كثير من البلاد، وحتى لو مات الناس فيها أو جاعوا ما يضر، في الصومال أو في أفغانستان على سبيل المثال. أو تقوم على صناعة أسلحة تقتل الإنسان ولكنها تحافظ على المباني وعلى الإنشاءات. أصبح الإنسان أحط رتبة عندهم من الحيوان وأحط من الأدوات التي يحاولون قتلها.
Distinguished participants from different parts of the world, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Mehmet Ali Büyükkara from Marmara University in Istanbul. It is a great pleasure for me to address you at another session of the international conference entitled Contemporary Reformers, Salman al-Auda, the example of reform, the example of Islah. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my warmest greetings to all of you. We hope that this conference creates a global awareness about unacceptable condition of one of the most important personalities of recent times, Sheikh Salman al-Auda, who has been kept unjustly in jail for 3 years in bad conditions without trial. We pray God to save him, to rescue him from this cruelty as soon as possible, inshallah. The title of our panel today is The Case Against Tyranny. I host 4 esteemed scholars who are appearing as on-air guests from London and Washington. During this session, they are going to talk about Dr. Salman al-Auda and socio-political situations that led his imprisonment. I would like to remind that our time is 5 minutes for each speaker, for 5 or 6 minutes maximum. Let me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Wala Quays. Wala Kuwais took her PhD from University of Oxford on neo-traditionalism in the West. She was a visiting fellow at the sociology department at Istanbul Şehir University, my former institution. She is now teaching in the University of Birmingham in England. His title of speech is The Intolerance of the Politics of Tolerance. I think the best title to be given to describe this situation. Yes, Dr. Wala, what is this tolerance? What are its aspects? The voice is yours, please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And as you've kindly mentioned, I'd like to sort of frame our discussion here. And I'd like to note particularly that authoritarian regimes, authoritarian Arab regimes, even long before the Arab Spring, even those that espoused secular values have used religion and religious groups as integral parts of their policy strategies. So we've seen cases such as in Egypt, Syria, Libya, the United Arab Emirates, and to a degree Saudi Arabia, although the formulation of such tolerance or discourse on tolerance is quite different. So I'll try to make some references, particularly in the case of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The question of how we make sense of a discourse of religious toleration and even interfaith initiatives and appeals to orthodoxy while doing that becomes sort of a question of how the state tries to monopolize everything around it. Because authoritarian states, because these are authoritarian states, they really see everything as forms of security threats. And so their initiatives really parallel or mirror these security threats or these security concerns. So you can see that there is some sort of discrepancy in their stated value systems and policies and the internal logic that they espouse. So for one, they might be secular and modernist in their sort of approach to the economy and sort of construction, but they can sort of promote an internal traditionalism. The state likes to hire what I call religious epistemic communities, and these are sort of networks of religious scholars that have what I contend are policy relevant epistemic criteria, which they can then also hire and they can also fire. And from which they derive a legitimacy, creating a sense of religious homogeneity in everything, which deems everything outside the state as suspect. So, yeah, everything outside the discourse of the state becomes suspect and in turn criminalized. On the internal religious front, it shows that any religious discourse that has no affinity to the state and does not center the state as kind of heterodox. And we see that from religious scholars that deem their enemies as khawarij. Or, yeah. Therefore, if we return to the question of why the discourse of tolerance and the interfaith initiatives are important, we have to understand that what the state is reacting against. Tolerance, in a sense, is not really about religious tolerance. It's about tolerating or having the state as the central focal point, and anything outside that cannot be tolerated. And so internal enemies, whether they're religious dissidents, reformers, political dissidents, religious reformers, human rights activists, or pro-democracy thinkers, are presented as some sort of religious other. In the case of Arab authoritarian regimes, they often deem them as this elusive Islamist figure or Islamist boogeyman. In reality, if we look back into the internal logic of the state and their policy and policy concerns, they constantly reframe and recreate who their enemy is to push them outside the margins of legality. And these laws are constructed from a top-down approach with no social conversation, and then they create a sense where someone that they deem as an enemy does not just exist outside the law. They exist outside the conception of the state, and they're pushed out of society. And that's how sort of prisons function. So they're criminalized because they're pushed out of this conception of toleration, and they're deemed to be subversive social figures. So the propaganda that they spew in society is to push them outside the margins. The logic in this context is very much steeped in authoritarian practices, but also within the logic of the war on terror, such as the enemy of the state becomes the quote-unquote Islamist, who's deemed inherently intolerant, and this can be really anyone. This is very useful for the state to police and punish dissent, real or imagined, by the way. So someone might not actually be a dissident, but the state can deem him as such, and therefore he's pushed outside of the constraints of legality and is deemed as sort of inherently subversive and problematic. It's not just an internal policy strategy, but it's also to govern sort of political rivals in the West, and particularly within the Muslim community. And we see this in the case of the United Arab Emirates, where they funded a lot of right-wing and Islamophobic groups, such as in France, Marine Le Pen. From the perspective of UAE policymakers, we can see that the problem is independent Muslim agency that exists within these sort of thinkers and activists. From within their logic, independent agency needs to be constantly controlled through constant threats of violence, physical and political coercion. In this sense, the state is inherently anti-agentic. It has a problem in seeing agency within a subject. So if they arrest religious reformers, feminist activists, or even liberals, there's this form of intersectionality that develops from the vantage point of the state, not because these people are unified by some sort of ontology of the oppressed. Rather, it is the problem is agency wherever the state can see it, whether that is in religion, politics, or whatever else. So just to go back to the concept or the notion or the role that religious epistemic communities play in the language of tolerance, firstly, they do so to emphasize the role as the state as the only guardian and legitimator of political tolerance, that then society, in a sense, is inherently intolerant, and these people need a strong state, needs strong leaders in order to prevent them from causing chaos. And that's what that religious discourse kind of legitimizes. And we see this very early on in the Marrakesh Declaration, for example, where the discourse was on minority rights, but in actuality, like, the clauses were emphasizing the role of the state, the legitimacy of the state in maintaining this fiqh of citizenship that develops. It provides a platform for political actors and other religious groups to advance their policy agendas by curbing religious dissent. And we can see this particularly in the Forum for Promoting Peace and other interfaith initiatives in the United Arab Emirates, where people, sort of pro-Modi groups, were present or were directly in conversation with the state, or even Christian Zionist movements. And I'd like to just finally note that just as policymakers can hire epistemic communities, they can also fire them. That is to say, the affinity to a particular religious discourse and its effective at any given period can change. And again, we've seen this directly in the case of the United Arab Emirates, where they've simultaneously hired or used sort of neo-traditionalist epistemic communities and also modernist ideas simultaneously, because the aim is a policy project. So this can be terminated once the conditions are no longer available or there's no need for it. So there is a limit to that. So even the discourse of tolerance can sort of shift when there isn't the conditions that where toleration is not the sort of way forth to proceed with a sort of a certain policy agenda. And so the main point of the state, as we see it, is sort of self-preservation, as maintaining a sort of homogeneous coercive control over thought, over society, and over people. I hope I didn't go too long over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right, the turn is another guest, Usama Al-Azami. Professor Al-Azami is the member of the University of Oxford, St. Antony's College. He is teaching and researching primarily on Islamism, political Islam, modern Islamic movements. He is now working on the reception of the Hakimiyya doctrine of Islamism. The title of his speech is Salman al-Auda and the Question of Revolution. We really wondered what kind of understanding of revolution Sheikh Salman al-Auda has. Dr. Azami, have your say, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khairan, brother. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And I'd like to sort of speak today in the short period, the short time that we have, about Sheikh Salman al-Auda's book, As'ilat al-Thawra. And in a sense, this is the book that got him in trouble with the Saudi state. So my title, Salman al-Auda and the Question of Revolution, is actually a reference to his book, not necessarily addressing specifically how he addresses revolution, which is a component of the discussion of the book. I'm going to focus specifically actually on the way in which he engages with certain verses in the Quran, certain hadiths, which seem to exhort obedience to rulers. And Sheikh Salman is not entirely original in this regard, but his contribution is very significant given his stature as a very prominent scholar in Saudi, but someone who has a following that is global, and someone who has shown himself to be independent. He's not someone who was necessarily sort of affiliated or tied to any particular group, and he was certainly not someone who had been co-opted by the state. And this is something that Madawi al-Rashid talks about. This Salman al-Auda was the one they couldn't control, and that's why they sort of put him in prison in the way that they've done so far. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate his swift release, inshallah. So Sheikh Salman talks in this book about, and it's not a very long book, but I wanted to address mainly two hadiths. One verse from the Quran, one hadith. In the short time that we have. So the verse in the Quran is the very well-known verse from Surah An-Nisa. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. And now, basically, the first part is what really is invoked by authoritarians. O you who believe, obey God and obey the Messenger and those in authority among you. And the classical interpretation of this, of those in authority among you, is al-ulama wal-umara, the scholars and the rulers. But in the present time, the emphasis on the part of states and the scholars that they sponsor and the scholars that they promote quite aggressively, and therefore the ones that get the greatest attention, the emphasis is on the umara component of that. So the political rulers are to be obeyed. And Sheikh Salman, basically invokes the classical tafsir on this particular verse, and he points out that there's a very deliberate removal of the verb obey when it's referring to wa ulil amri minkum. It says obey God and obey the messenger, which signals that this is an unconditional obedience. Wa ulil amri minkum signals that or the lack of the citation of the verb obey signals that this is not quite the same. And it's further indicated by the rest of the verse, which is very often not cited by these people. فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. If you disagree about anything, so it already countenances or envisages the fact that people may disagree with or a person may disagree with one's rulers. And this isn't something which is considered a problem in the Quran, except that it does provide a means of dealing with it. It's not a problem that is a questioning of one's faith or anything like that. It says, then revert back to the God and his messenger. So refer these disagreements to God and his messenger if you truly believe in God and the last day. So in a sense, Sheikh Salman is trying to bring back what has been almost deliberately forgotten in contemporary discourse that is very state-centric, that wants to emphasize the sort of centrality of the ruler in the modern state. He's trying to bring back the tradition and trying to bring back a recognition of the subtlety and the nuance that the tradition contains. And very briefly, in the remaining time that I have, I want to refer to a famous hadith, which, again, it's as though no other hadith exists for some of these people who invoke hadiths like this. A hadith which is found, admittedly, in Sahih Muslim and in a number of other collections, in which Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman, the companion of the Prophet, in conversation with the Prophet about how to deal with times of fitna, asks the Prophet about, what one should do when one's rulers have become evil. And the Prophet ﷺ responds, Isma' wa ati' al-amir wa in daraba dhahrak wa akhadha malak. And there are slight variations on this. Hear and obey your ruler, even if they sort of take your wealth and they strike your back. And Sheikh Salman's strategy in dealing with this hadith is, one that has existed before. Again, he cites ad-Daraqutni's critique of the isnad of this particular hadith. And also the contemporary Salafi scholar Muqbil ibn Hadi al-Wadi'i also critiques this hadith. And also he cites that it runs in contradiction if it's taken on its surface meaning with a number of other hadiths, such as the exhortation that man qutila duna mali fahuwa shaheed, whoever dies defending his wealth is considered a shaheed. Unfortunately, I think I've come to the end of my time. I just want to conclude by saying that this vision that Sheikh Salman presents represents, I think, an entirely sort of recognizable reading of the classical tradition that was arguably predominant in the pre-modern period. But modern state-centric visions are trying to reformulate this tradition and say that obedience is absolute by selectively picking certain hadiths and certain parts of verses in the Quran. And this is why he's being punished right now. And we hope that his vision sort of lives on. Those of us who are free can still help to promote, in a sense, this democratic vision of accountable leadership. Jazakumullah khair.
Sorry, Professor Usama Al-Azami, I have a question. What place do you put the concept of Savra, concept of revolution in his thought, in this respect?
So Sheikh Salman, in a sense, what he's saying is that the notion of absolute obedience is to be rejected. That's not Islamic. But in the first part of his book, he does highlight that thawra, or revolution, is not desirable in and of itself. It's usually a consequence of circumstances that are themselves undesirable. And sometimes it forces itself upon a people. And in a sense, he is exhorting people to, and this obviously applies to rulers, perhaps first and foremost, to not create the conditions that bring about thawra. And those conditions, he primarily is concerned about injustice and arbitrary rule. Of course, rulers also don't want to bring about thawra, and they want to realize that through, the unjust and tyrannical rulers want to maintain their power by repressing and suppressing any form of dissent. And I think this is going to be sort of a battle that goes on. But I think the compelling Islamic arguments are certainly with people like Salman al-Auda. And I also think that repression inevitably has to sort of give way at some point. But in some respects, that's my own sort of ideological commitment to justice, as it were.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Usama Al-Azami. Our third speaker in the panel is Dr. Jonathan Brown, Professor Jonathan Brown, sorry. He is the professor of Islamic civilization, working in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. The title of his speech is The Cultural and Scientific Value of Dr. Salman Al-Auda. What kind of values of Sheikh Salman have we been deprived of, Dr. Jonathan? Have your say, please.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to see my colleagues here and delighted to have a chance to speak on behalf of this great scholar, Allah Farajan, who may be released from prison. I think that, I was because looking at some of Sheikh Salman's books to get ready for this, I was reading his book Ma'al Mustafa, and there were just some lines that I wanted to read, and I keep in mind that a lot of really great Muslim scholars will talk about how there's a lot of scholars who know, let's say, the Islamic tradition very well. There's a lot of scholars who know the society around them very well. There's very few scholars who know both very well and know how to combine them together in the proper way to solve society's problems. And that kind of scholar is very valuable. But if you belong to this view of the that wala we're describing, which is the view of the world of a lot of governments in the world, you don't want that. You want people to worship the state, right? The state is the only thing that matters, and it really, in a way, is God, right? And so, in that case, a scholar who can really address people's problems convincingly and compellingly is not valuable, but is very dangerous, right? So that's why someone like Sheikh Salman gets put in prison, because he actually does very well the job of being a scholar, right? And we've seen this in the past with great Muslim scholars. If they are really effective at helping people understand their religion in a way that's going to transform them, they're seen as a threat. Someone like, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, right? Sheikh Salman, not only does he have incredible command of the Islamic intellectual tradition, spiritual tradition, but he's also been so good at applying that and voicing that, not only in a way that affects people, but also through media that affect people, that reach people. Like these videos, I was just watching this video he did, Mythlik, about kind of a YouTube video about reminding people to not be racist towards all the various kinds of people they see around them in Gulf countries, whether it's Filipino servants or Pakistani drivers. I mean, it's an amazingly compelling and affecting video that's telling people, look, kullukum min Adam wa Adam min turab, right? You are all, and to go out and see that we're all just dust, and to view others and treat others with the respect that they deserve as other children of Adam. So I mean, he's an incredibly powerful scholar, and I think that it's just so depressing and pathetic that there's Muslim governments and scholars working for these governments who don't treasure someone like that, but instead want to punish them, and not want to punish them in the most brutal way, right? Want to punish their families. It's just disgusting. I mean, it's unconscionable, and it's takfir al-ni'mah, right? I mean, you're denying this wonderful bounty that God has given us in the form of some scholars who are really knowledgeable and conscientious people. And so I just wanted to read this, just some paragraphs from his book. He's just talking about, he says, the importance of this rule lies particularly in the fact that God knows about the vicissitudes of life. Nations change from civilization to backwardness and weakness, from great numbers to small numbers, from wealth to poverty and scarcity, and so on. So that one rigid way would not be appropriate for different people. This is why the chapter in Surah Al-Zumar, verse 18, we have those, we find those who hear the word and follow the best thereof. Right? this is actually, think about what we're talking about in terms of the state, what I was talking about. Right? He's saying the state is the least worthy thing of worship. It's the least worthy thing of respect. Why? Because it's constantly changing, and it's simply a matter of negotiation between people about power and resources. Right? Its job is not to give meaning to us. Its job is to help us live just functionally in this world. And that's why the Sharia doesn't ask us to worship the ruler. In fact, if anything, it tells us, to keep away from that world. But that world is a corrupting world. You don't want to make that the thing that defines you. It's disgusting, right? It is safe, therefore, he says, to say that some of the best jurisprudence one can possess is the skill of choice, that is, making the right choice among the different opinions, situations, and acts depending on the circumstances. One may face different instances of truth, but it is the peak of wisdom to perceive the great importance of the verse to those who hear the word and follow the best thereof. And just reading this book, you see how he takes these ideas and he's applying them to the problems of racism, of discrimination. And then just a few paragraphs later, I was thinking about this earlier. He says, Muslim scholars have decided that the Kaaba should be left as it is, so that kings would not take it as a toy, each destroying and rebuilding it at will, right? So not only is kind of making the state something that you worship and making it something that defines our religion, such that if we're in a conflict with Qatar, we say that Qatar is like where the Khawarij came from, and then we make up with Qatar, and then we all pretend that never happened, and the Qataris are fine. This is just, think about how we're like literally torturing and twisting our religion just for the most ephemeral and superficial political whims. But this is actually also betrayal of something that even Muslim rulers, with all their problems, knew from the very beginning, which is you don't touch the Kaaba, right? The Kaaba shouldn't be a toy of politics. Religion isn't a toy of politics. Right? Religion is something that's supposed to move people and help people get sa'ada fi darain, in this life and the next. And so I think this is something that Sheikh Salman really emphasized, and I think his works and his speeches are a terrific resource for understanding and pursuing this. And I hope that he'll be free to continue to be a resource for us.
All right, Dr. Jonathan, I have a question. How can you evaluate Dr. Salman's journey from some sort of strict Salafism in his early days to the to become popular scholar, addressing to all Muslims from different denominations, from different ideologies? Can you explain this?
Yeah, well, I think if you were sort of cynical or skeptical, you could say that he changed based on trend or what was popular or what was expected of him. But I think a better way to look at it is, that the core of his teachings, the core of the teachings of any, committed Muslim scholar are not going to change, right? They're calling people to God and his Prophet, alayhi salam, right? But I think it's more about adjusting how you speak and adjusting your tone and your valence and your emphases based on what the society around you needs, right? If you see that, I think that a lot of people in the late after, let's say, 9/11 or in the late 1990s started to see that some of the kind of overemphasis on some aspects of Salafism had a negative impact on Muslim community, and so they start trying to kind of pull back away from that and move back to more maybe like a mean, kind of a virtuous mean. In fact, I think that some scholars, they really kind of stick to the books and they kind of live in an ivory tower, and they tend to be the ones who are really always focused on one view of the religion because they're not interacting with the world. Right? But if you're a scholar who's interacting with people in society, then you have to kind of move this direction, that direction, taking your message and making sure that it's affecting people in a good way and not being misunderstood or being over exaggerated or hyperbolized in one direction or the other.
Thank you very much, Professor John.
My pleasure.
All right. The turn is or another guest, the last guest, Professor Uwaymir Anjum. Professor Uwaymir is Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, University of Toledo in Ohio State in America. He is a specialist on Islamic political philosophy and cultural anthropology. The title of his speech is Islamic Political Thought in the Arab Spring. Yes, certainly we cannot fully understand what happened to Sheikh Salman without fairly evaluating the Arab Spring, its conditions, its aftermath, and consequences. The voice is yours, Dr. Uwaymir, please.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. It's an honor to be speaking about Sheikh Salman al-Auda and with my esteemed colleagues. And I remember I came across the writings and cassettes of Sheikh Salman al-Auda in the 90s. And I was immediately struck by his tone, where he was both very rigorously grounded in the Quran and the Sunnah. But there was something that stood out about him, which was that he was very rational, very compelling, very compassionate. And he was outward looking, meaning somebody who recognized that there is a world outside, that there are Muslims who are different. And even when he engaged in critique and dialogue, he did so with great respect. I remember reading his book, I think it was Al-Hiwar al-Hadi ma Sheikh al-Ghazali, a respectful dialogue with Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, the great Egyptian da'i and sheikh. And I came across this after when he was in prison, and so many of us who were in the United States, aware of sort of what's going on, we got to know Sheikh Salman al-Auda after the 90s when he objected to this great watershed moment in modern history when the Saudis invited American army to fight a war against other Muslims, and that was really shocking for a lot of people. And the religious establishment was made to go along with it, and the reason the religious establishment went with this disastrous decision, which proved to be disaster for the United States and for the region. But the ulama who were recruited to rubber stamp that religion were folks who were completely unaware of the world outside, and they really thought that other Muslims outside of Saudi and other people are mortal threat, and you could use the United States as your best friends because such decisions in their view were simply the realm of Waliul Amr. And so the ruler in this very myopic vision represents all the wisdom in the society. And Sheikh Salman al-Auda and the whole generation of scholars who were engaged in Sahwa, who were engaged in looking at the world outside, looking at Muslims, looking at the problem of colonialism, secularism, and looking at the deep problems within Muslim societies themselves, understood and objected to it and were imprisoned for that. And in some ways, as a historian who teaches the Middle East, this was a moment when everything went downhill. In some ways, you could have had a very different trajectory of the relationship between the United States and the Middle East itself, had a different decision been made at the time. The United States became an enemy of Islam in some imagination, including many in the United States policymaking circles, at that moment when there was a reaction in the Muslim world. And Muslims themselves, before that moment, saw the United States as a good power, as a good Westerners, unlike the British and the French who meddled in the affairs, the Americans who stayed outside. But the first Gulf War was the moment when it became, United States became, if you will, the new evil. And we never recovered from that. 9/11 was just one of the effects of that decision. So this shows the wisdom of scholars like Sheikh Salman al-Auda, and also shows that those who are religious scholars could have great foresight about what is right and what is not right for the Muslims at large, and not merely worried only about religious matters. And so these people really understood their stakes, and they spoke the truth, and they suffered for it, but they also woke up a whole generation of Muslims around the world to the new reality that was emerging. A scholar, Nazi Ayyubi, writes about the state in the Middle East, that it is not a strong state, it is a weak state. And because it is weak, it has to use power, it has to use force, it has to use brute violence in order to secure its advantages and its interests in the world, in both within and without. And so he calls it a fierce state like a beast, that doesn't, unlike a state or a government that has legitimacy, that has the power of using violence through rule of law, but also it is grounded in what people believe to be legitimate, and its structures of government are deeply accepted by the people. And that is the kind of state that does not need violence, even when there are great ruptures, great problems within the society. A state like that can avoid total breakdown, can avoid failure. And of course, we saw that in the United States in the wake of a white supremacist movement in Donald Trump. There was no civil war, there was no mass massacres, as there would have been had the state been superficial and not accepted and not legitimate. So I think that, turning to the question of Islamic political thought, this is one of the central problems for Muslim scholars to think about. How is it that a state in the Middle East will, and the Muslim world, will turn from an angry, secure, hurt, wounded beast that will hit and kill anyone that tries to suggest an improvement, that it sees as disagreement, and it hires a mercenary. Dr. Wala is very generous when she calls these scholars an epistemic community. These are in fact mercenaries. They are killers for hire. They are people who simply will say to go kill these innocent people because you want to, because it's in your interest, that it's okay to do so. They give fatwa to kill innocent Muslims, turn them into Khawarij and Kilab al-Nar, the same people that you sat in committees with and same people who taught you, you turn against them. These are people that are mercenaries, they're not scholars. And Sheikh Salman al-Auda and people like him, scholars like him, remind a whole generation of Muslims that are coming up, inshallah, that another kind of scholarship is possible, a kind of scholarship that speaks truth to power, that is أفضل الجهاد, which is إعلاء كلمة الحق عند سلطان جائر. And as such, what Sheikh Salman al-Auda and scholars like him have contributed is life and love of deen to a whole, we pray, a whole generation of scholars to come. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
I have a short question. I expect you a short answer, please. Do you still consider Sheikh Salman al-Auda within Sahwa movement?
I think the Sahwa movement was not a very unified top-down movement that had one manifesto. Sahwa was a general, sort of a generational awareness of scholars. And so as such, yes, there are people in the Sahwa movement that had very different approaches. Sheikh Salman al-Auda was in some ways, for many scholars around the world, was the voice and face of the Sahwa movement because I remember he was reaching out to, in Saudi, for example, he was reaching out to the Sufis and he was reaching out to the Shia and having this dialogue, which is a kind of thing that most people couldn't imagine in Saudi or, in fact, elsewhere in many cases. And so, in my view, yes, he was the best face of the Sahwa movement.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, with Professor Anjum, we have come to the end of the panel. I would like to thank to everyone who has participated in this meaningful and purposeful event. I especially thank to Dr. Kuwais, Professor Uwaimir Anjum, Professor Jonathan Brown, Professor Usama Al-Azami for joining us here at the conference. I repeat our sincere supplication to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for salvation of all the oppressed, wherever they are. Thank you. Thank you. I wish you well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We concluded our first day. Thank you very much, all the panelists and speakers, for sharing their research, thoughts, and ideas during this very timely and important conference. Don't forget that tomorrow we will continue with Arabic. We will have great speakers and great panels tomorrow with translation to English and Turkish. Thank you very much again for participating in this conference. Modern Reformers. Ma salama.